whole room started to shake. I really thought I was going to die.
Welcome to AskDEC. This is your chance to ask people from the DEC and experts from our member agencies about our response to the devastating earthquake in Nepal. A little over 10 days ago, we saw a massive earthquake that killed thousands of people and left hundreds of thousands of people homeless. It's been a huge struggle to get past roads blocked by avalanches, to organise a massive aid effort on an enormous scale to reach 8 million people who've been affected. Our member agencies are now making real progress in doing that. We have reached over 300,000 people, but there is still an absolutely enormous amount still to do. And we recognise that people do have questions about that aid effort and how we can do more to reach more people quickly, particularly in rural areas. Before we get started, I'm going to introduce our panel. And we're going to start with Anoni Chadburn from Tear Fund, who's their Director of Emergencies. Next to her is Kat Carter from the Emergency Response Unit of Save the Children. Then Tanya Barron from Plan International, their Chief Executive. And my Chief Executive, the Chief Executive of DEC, Salah Saeed. And I'm Brendan Paddy. I'm the Head of Communications at the DEC. But before we go to the panel with some of the questions we have from you, and there's still time to throw in more questions at us, either below in the comments or on hashtag AskDEC. Before we do that, what I really want to do is hear from Depesh. Depesh works for World Vision. He was in Nepal when the earthquake happened, and he is going to tell us about what that experience was like and what he's been doing since. Some way, 10 days or so after the quake, I'm seeing the numbers of people reached dramatically increase. What is it like now going on a distribution to a rural area? Can you talk us through what that feels like and looks like?
On the first day, it was really chaotic in terms of people being desperate to try to take things. But as we have moved forward, we've been really trying to ensure that the goods that we distribute are going to real needed communities. So there is a process of trying to do assessment, trying to identify which are the households which are most impacted. And there are a lot of community mechanisms which are existing, and also other mechanisms which might at times not supportive, but we need to respect the local culture, local various communities and parties and all the mechanisms there. So working along with them to see that how we identify the most vulnerable and try to give the tarpaulins or the blankets or the relief goods to them has been a priority. So in days to come, we will try to see that we are very much intentional in terms of targeting. Apart from it, we have targeted many places and we are committed to reach more than around 100,000 beneficiaries with which around 20,000 households. We've identified some target areas that we'll be reaching, and we're working out logistics to see that how we reach those areas. But I tell you, it's been challenging, and as personally to be a part of the country, as a citizen, to look onto the needs and also to balance with respect to the ongoing challenges has been something which still I'm getting used to. Yeah. It was on the second day of the earthquake, Sunday. I was going to this area called Bhaktapur, and there are a lot of UNESCO heritages and the temples and houses which are there. I was we were the relief goods were in front of us, and I was in back, and suddenly this around 60 years old person comes to me and tells me, please, can you have a look at my house? It's really cracked. I cannot go in, and my children cannot go in. And it was really a moment of a touching moment for me to see that for a couple of days, for 5 days, I was refugee in front of my own house. At least my house is not gone, but there are many people whose houses are gone. The children do not want to go in. And that really depicted the need of the magnitude of problem that we have. It's not about the loss of the person. It is not only about the physical loss, but a lot of emotional issues which comes down to it. And many people, including myself, are yet to overcome it in days to come. There are a lot of stories, but I also need to allude to this very fact that there's hope. There's also a sense of coordination among various players. There's also a sense of trying to see that how we overcome all these odds and try to see that we have a better future, a safer future as well.
Thank you, Deepesh. That's been really helpful to hear. Thank you so much for your time, and I really wish you every luck, both for your family, but also with the amazing work you're doing with World Vision. Just extraordinary to hear from Deepesh there. So the first thing he did when the earthquake happened, he was telling me, was he rang his family to tell them that he was safe. And the second thing he did was contact his colleagues. And immediately, once they knew they were safe, they started organising the response from the ruins of where they'd been staying. They started to organise and think about how they could reach out to help others in the chaos that followed the earthquake. And the first question I really have follows on from that in some ways. It's from Donna on Facebook, and she's saying, can we be sure when we donate that the money will really get to the people who need it? And Ona, you've done many, many emergency responses all over the world. How can we be confident that in this chaos we can actually get out through?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a fair question and it's a fair challenge. I think the first thing to say is that, as you heard from World Vision there, organisations such as DEC agencies have been on the ground for many, many years. Tearfund had a presence in Nepal for over 40 years. We know the communities, we know the local NGOs, we know the government, where the landscape is, but to get the information about who is worst affected and from what location, your telecommunications have gone down, so there's no mobile phone, there's no internet, there's all of this information needs to be gathered because we're really concerned about the most vulnerable, we're really concerned about those who are the worst affected, and we really want to go out and find them and serve them the best. So that means getting into these really remote and rural areas.
Mm. And thinking about that, I mean, the mountainous terrain of Nepal actually really worked against us when we're trying to launch that response because of the landslides, because of the very narrow roads, trying to get vehicles down them, because you can't communicate ahead to find out where the needs are and how damaged it was. And of course, the other thing to remember is that the infrastructure of Nepal itself was damaged. So when I first turned up, there was chaos at the airport, a very tiny airport in Kathmandu. And speaking to the staff at the airport, of course, their colleagues who should be at work had either been killed or lost a family member or their homes had been destroyed, and the same with the doctors, the nurses, the police force. So the whole infrastructure that you would expect to kick in was also damaged.
And Tanya, Plan's been in Nepal for years, and you were actually visiting the country when the earthquake happened.
Yes, I was visiting for completely other reasons, just to look at projects. Plan's been there, as have so many of the DEC members, for over 30 years. And so it was a very shocking, literally traumatizing event. You know, I was very shocked, and I saw people in the villages that we had to then travel through who were, you know, really quiet, and children with kind of eyes, and you could see that apart from the terrible loss which we've been hearing about of property, buildings and so on, just very, very traumatic and distressing. But actually one of the things that I think is interesting is that because we've all been there for so long, all the villages that I was travelling through right immediately after the earthquake, where houses were brought down to rubble, nevertheless, most of those villages have disasters committees. There was a lot of disaster preparedness. We knew this would happen. It wasn't a, you know, it wasn't an if, it was a when. And actually it was really encouraging to see so many of these villages who knew what to do, difficult getting the aid through very quickly, but it actually surprisingly quickly, within a few hours, I was seeing village level, these disaster committees getting plastic together, getting people outside, creating you know, community shelters. So there was actually some really good news amongst the devastation.
And so it's surprising, I suppose, for many people, shocking even, that aid isn't getting to people immediately, because of course they need it immediately. But in some ways, given the amazing challenges that we're having to face in these circumstances, it's amazing how fast we can move. And it's partly, as you rightly say, Tanya, because we've been working with those communities for years and helping them prepare to help themselves.
Absolutely.
And Sally, I've got a question from Marg Hardcastle on Twitter, and she's been asking us actually for a number of days now about a particular village. It's above a place called Halambu, and I think we actually have some good news.
Absolutely. Let me share with Marg and all the viewers out there that this very afternoon we heard that ActionAid, one of our DEC member agencies, actually reached that very village and distributed food packs today. So it's absolutely a logistical nightmare in terms of the challenge that we have to work with in Nepal. We're seeing landslides, we're seeing roads blocked. As we've already just heard, the airport is very small. So the demand and the need is huge. And obviously, we need to reach as many people as possible, and that will take time. But aid is getting through.
And obviously, the people are now using, digital media increasingly to share these concerns. Often they're from the diaspora community. Sometimes they're people who've visited Nepal and they still have friends and contacts there. They're contacting us in some cases. They're contacting our member agencies in London. That's not really the way that this information is gathered and used by the aid response teams, is it?
No, it's absolutely essential. And, we're talking with members on the ground, we're talking with the UN, and obviously they're coordinating in Kathmandu, and that's absolutely the right place to coordinate. It makes absolutely no sense to try to coordinate a huge logistical operation like this from London or from any other city for that matter. So it's more effective, it makes sense, its communication is closer to the ground, and the intelligence and the information that's gathered is in Nepal, not here in London, so it has to be done at that level.
And that does kind of bring us to a question we had from Charisma on Facebook. And she was saying, with so much money being given, why does it not seem to have got past Kathmandu? And I can see why she would have that impression. A lot of the coverage has been of Kathmandu and also of villages outside Kathmandu that haven't been reached. I mean, why do we think that is the impression people have? Is it true?
I think you have to really consider, I hate to go back to the train, but we've got to give it the good emphasis that it really is an issue. And it reminds me a little bit of the Kashmir earthquake, where we had the same dynamic. We had a 6-week window there where we had to get in tents to support communities in most remote parts of Kashmir because the winter was setting in. We've got this window. We're very aware that the monsoon is coming. We're very aware that some of these roads are going to be impassable again later. They're not tarmac roads as we would know them. Some of them are dirt tracks. Some of these villages you can only get access to by donkey. Some of these villages you can only get access to by foot and by trekking. And I think it's really important to recognise that that will add hours to the way that aid is distributed. And I just think we also need to recognise the infrastructure, as Kat's already mentioned. The airport, it's doing the best it can. The government is very aware of the issues it's grappling with. It's working alongside the UN to try and resolve these issues, and I think their awareness is really going to help the issue.
Can I just add on to that point? We have to also remember that Nepal, before the earthquake, was a very poor country. Around half of the population didn't have access to running water, and many of those remote villages, it took hours to walk to the nearest road.
Yeah.
So before even the earthquake, it was a logistical nightmare in terms of getting things around and getting aid there. So now it's obviously even more complicated, more difficult.
But I'd also say that there is something, I think, quite psychologically challenging when a capital city is, all but destroyed in parts of it. And I think there were really good reasons for people to concentrate on Kathmandu. It was a devastating blow to their city. And, as we discussed earlier, people have been getting to the villages pretty quickly. Some of the villages are very self-reliant. They've always had to be because of the geography of the country. But Kathmandu itself, as we've been discussing, is a city which has severe infrastructure problems. So when I was there, even on the Saturday, the people who could no longer stay in their homes, even those homes which were still standing because they were so dangerous, were moved quite quickly into camps, which were the government did a good job. I think within a day, by Sunday night, there were something like 16 camps set up. But the Kathmandu Valley already had dramatic water supply problems. So, immediately you could see that the water supply is a really serious problem. They were trying to, cart in water. The water quality is not good, shortages. So, sanitation, pretty quickly in some of those camps. I was there, and you could see families queuing up to use very, poor sanitation, which was ill supplied by water. This is not a, this is a recipe for other problems and health issues, I think.
Absolutely.
I think what we've seen is obviously there's been a combination of events and things that have made this particular disaster as bad as it is. There's obviously how shallow the earthquake was, the density in the population in places like Kathmandu, the poor buildings, and that's obviously made it really difficult, really challenging. But the good news is obviously a lot of the member agencies, as you know, we've been talking about, is that you've been there for so many years, preparing, planning with the communities. So in a way, that's good news, and that's reduced the number of casualties, and thankfully people are better prepared to be able to move on with their lives.
Yes.
Thank you. So this is AskDEC. If you have a question for our panel about what's going on in Nepal and how the aid effort is going, you can ask it in comments below, or you can ask it on Twitter using the hashtag AskDEC. So the next question we have is looking at how the costs stack up in times of crisis. And I think there are really two parts of this, and we may come to you first on this. What happens to costs in a place like Kathmandu after a terrible disaster? And Stella, I might come to you next to talk about the costs in the UK, because I know that's a real concern for many people. But perhaps Anoni first.
Yeah, I mean, again, a fair challenge. I think coming back a little bit to the communities, I mean, one of the reasons that we want to work with these communities in advance of these kind of disasters is that we know that if we've supported them, then they will be able to work alongside us at a time of crisis and actually make sure that the right decisions are made about where the money should be programmed. We really do work with the beneficiaries to ensure that they actually tell us exactly what is needed, when and where. But we have issues at times like this that the petrol prices tend to go up. You know, at times like this, access to vehicles and therefore vehicle costs will go up as well. It's heartbreaking in a way, because market economies kind of like happen still, and prices go up, and you say, well, actually these people are in need. We don't want to have to pay these things, but we need to have the access to these vehicles. We need to have access to petrol and things like that. So you do have some overheads, but we work really hard, and I cannot emphasize that enough. We've got systems, procedures, we review our own way that we do our own expenditure, and we make sure that as much as possible that aid actually gets to the people who are in need.
And Kat, I hear, you know, obviously hotel prices in Kathmandu are pretty astronomical, and you had some pretty luxurious accommodation. Do you want to come clean?
Absolutely. Yes, when I first arrived in Kathmandu, I was sleeping in a car park. So I spent most of the week sleeping outside in the car park because our office was too damaged. So yeah, I mean, really very back to basics, which we all expected. We were also told to be completely self-sufficient in terms of food and water. So we were carrying backpacks full of water, and I had some dried apricots because I didn't plan quite as well as my colleagues. So I was surviving off dried apricots for breakfast, lunch and dinner. So yeah, really five-star accommodation and support there.
It can be pretty crude immediately after a disaster. Tanya, what was it like for you? Because you were caught up in the midst of this. What were you finding in terms of your ability to get around? What was the impact in terms of all the logistics? Because that's part of where the costs comes from, isn't it?
Yes, I think we were all ready, as I said, to go on a perfectly normal project trip, looking at some wonderful projects, keeping girls in school, and so on. Immediately, everything changed, and that was that hotels were not safe to stay in, so we were all sleeping out of doors. It was pretty full of mosquitoes and so on. That's life. And we were actually immediately in the same situation as all our Nepali colleagues, because everybody was sleeping out of doors and staying out of doors. And one of the things that I think was interesting was that the landslides and the roadblocks made a journey that I was doing that should have taken 7 hours, took over 12 hours. That's going to be the story on and on for weeks and weeks. I mean, we were very happy to see that the Nepali police were doing a great job. I mean, they were clearing the roadblocks fairly quickly, but nevertheless, I mean, it's an overwhelming task, actually. Yeah. But I would like to say something about the cost and the finances. One of the reasons why the member agencies really want to join and belong to the DEC is because we have incredibly thorough accountability systems in place, and it's a really great system. So, really down to the cup of coffee, the pennies and pounds. There's a very good, accountable, transparent system. So yes, of course there are costs, and that's why we need support. But I think you'd be jolly hard pushed to find any system of delivering aid that was this accountable.
And there's that brings us to the next bit of the question, which I should have said was from Charisma on Facebook. Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Brendan, before that, can I just answer the question about perhaps costs here in the
Yes,
UK?
no, that's exactly what I was coming to, Sally. Do take that question.
Yeah, so we're fortunate in that the DEC brings together the 13 leading UK humanitarian agencies. So we coordinate together here in the UK to fundraise from the public and reduce the costs as low as possible. So, for example, over the last 5 years, our fundraising and overhead costs in the DEC is less than 4%. That's an amazing figure, and I think it's because we're able to bring those members together and not compete and ask for funds from so many different people and coordinate that. And then the second advantage is that our member agencies can coordinate with government and with UN in Nepal to make sure that those costs are also saved there.
Thank you, Sally. And I think we have the most extraordinary partners. We have the broadcasters in the UK backing us for free. Yeah. And when you have the BBC and ITV and Sky and Channel 4 and Channel 5, everyone else on your side, it makes an enormous difference. Yeah, you can run the appeal incredibly cost effectively.
We are so fortunate here in the UK in that, as you mentioned, all those broadcasters and so many different corporates and organisations actually do come together and join with the DEC to make sure that we save those costs. And it's wonderful, as we've already seen, £45 million raised in just over a week. That's
and just to add to that, I mean, we all collaborate on the ground. Really, I mean, where we can work together, where we can share costs, we do it. I was only on an interagency phone call this afternoon where we were talking about how we can share costs to achieve some goals for the actual Nepal response.
Yes, we had an example. I mean, when I was there, I went to these disaster committees at the village level, and it was really great because, in fact, Plan has been working with Red Cross, both members of the DEC, for 15 years actually in preparing supplies, and we shared. So, you know, we had blankets, they had tents. There's some really practical collaboration going on, which actually is making it all much easier.
And that question, I should say correctly, came from Maya on Facebook, and it's a good one. It's one lots of people want the answer to.
That's fair.
Absolutely. Great. And so I think the next question I was going to ask was, this is quite a specific one, Sally, and I thought I'd throw it to you, and that is, you know, how is the money actually divided amongst our member agencies? You know, we've got 3 member agencies here, 13 in total. How on earth do we decide in the heat of the moment who gets what?
Well, put simply, it is based on the global capacity of our member agencies to be able to respond to these emergencies. We've already covered that they are the 13 leading UK humanitarian-based agencies. So those kind of decisions are based on capacity beforehand. So we need to respond as quickly as possible so members already know, literally within days of us launching the appeal, how much funds they're going to get so they can make those commitments straight away and respond immediately. It's not about filling in long forms or protracted sort of case studies and things like that. It's about knowing which members can deliver when and making sure that they have that money straight away.
And Anoni, I might come to you on that, because a lot of funding is on the basis of grants. It's quite restricted sometimes about where it can be spent, what it can be spent on, what the time scale is during which it can be spent. How important is having that freedom, you know, meeting very high standards to be part of the DEC, and being such a well-established agency like Tier Fund, but you know, being in that position where you have some free money, where you have discretion to make decisions based on your expert judgments. How important is that to you?
It makes an enormous difference. It makes an enormous difference because I think we've got the flexibility to really do proper assessment of the needs on the ground and then say, actually, we possibly thought it was that way, but you know what? We've realised afterwards it's actually this that they need. We thought they might need a bit more around health, but actually it's about water and sanitation, and we've got the freedom to be able to change that. We've got the freedom to be able to meet those needs right where it is. So we do enjoy having the DEC money. It's really useful for us, and it does give us a lot of flexible opportunity, a lot of flexible funding, and it gives us immediate opportunity. And it's great for us to come alongside a government and say, look, we can serve these needs now. You don't have to wait until another government gives money to you and then you have to program it through. We've got this money now and we want to help you and we want to work alongside you now. So that's really useful to get immediacy and get really down to the ground where the need is greatest.
Thanks. I mean, that's another great question from Ken. That was one that came through on Facebook in the comments. You can ask questions below wherever you're watching the feed. We'll pick those up. And if you're on Twitter, you can use the hashtag AskDEC. But what we're going to do now is go back to how we started this appeal, because we were talking just a moment ago about the incredible support we have from the UK broadcasters. We also get the most amazing support from celebrities, and we were very fortunate to have Joanna Lumley front our appeal when we launched just 10 days ago, and it had the most extraordinary reaction.
On Saturday, terror for millions as the ground beneath them shook. Lives wrecked, homes turned to rubble, roads blocked and livelihoods destroyed. Nepal is a beautiful country with an ancient culture. 2,000 years of history razed to the ground in minutes. The earthquake may have lasted little more than 60 seconds. The impact will be felt here. But the emergency is now, the need for help desperate. The majority of families who have either lost their homes or are just too scared to return to them, they're now left to live out in the open, many with no shelter at all. Nepal's few hospitals have been overwhelmed, with those injured treated in the streets. My father served with the Gurkhas, who for 200 years have sacrificed their lives for Britain. Now it's our turn to help their country. The Nepalese are a proud and resourceful people who don't ask for much, but now many hundreds and thousands of them urgently need our support. If they don't receive help soon, food, water and medicine, disease might well take hold. So far, we are still to hear from some of the more remote parts of the country. The reports we have heard indicate the damage has been extensive, and some villages have been completely destroyed. The Disasters Emergency Committee's member agencies are on the ground and are already responding, but they're racing against time. And we can help them by donating. Online to the DEC Nepal Earthquake Appeal at dec.org.uk. By calling our 24-hour donation line on 0370 60 60 900. On your mobile by texting GIVE to 70,000 to give £5, or by sending a cheque to this address. Every pound counts. Just £25 will provide clean water for 4 families for a month. £50 can feed a family for 2 weeks, and £100 can pay for emergency shelter for 4 families. So please act now. Just a few moments of our time could save the lives of these brave people. Thank you so much.
So this is AskDEC, your chance to ask experts from the DEC and our member agencies about the situation in Nepal and the aid effort and how it's going. We've just seen Joanna Lumley. She was doing the appeal both on BBC and ITV. I think that's a first. I don't believe we've ever had the same person front both those appeals before. And it was very personal for her, as you could probably tell, because of her family history, her father serving in the Gurkha Rifles as an officer, and so she was very committed to doing this. And I think the public response reflected that. One, people feel very strongly connected to Nepal, but two, I think they did respond to Joanna Lumley's appeal. Sela, I've got a question here actually from Nicola on Twitter, and she's saying she's sad to see a lot of cynicism about donating to charities, and she said, how generous do we feel the public have been in response to this?
Well, I think the figures speak for themselves. In less than 10 days, the public has given over £45 million, and our government has matched from that £5 million. And every single disaster that DEC has launched an appeal for, the public has been so generous. Only a few months ago, we launched an appeal for Ebola, and before that for Gaza, and they're continuously digging deep and giving to these emergencies, and it is making a difference. In less than 10 days, our member agencies have reached over 300,000 people in Nepal with life-saving aid, whether it be water, medicines and shelter. So I think the connection is there. People see that there is a need, the case is strong, and they want to help, and the DEC has been proved to be able to provide that platform for them. So obviously we're very grateful for having such a wonderful, generous public, and we'd like to say thank you very much for that.
And we don't like to make comparisons, obviously, because we're very grateful for whatever the public feel they can afford to give. But I think it is fair to say that this is one of the strongest responses we've seen. We've seen a number of big appeals recently, Haiti, the Philippines, and this really is not far off the kinds of money we saw coming in for those, which is quite extraordinary.
Yeah, I think so, and I think also there's a really strong connection between the UK and Nepal. The brave Gurkhas, fought side by side with the British in their time of need, as it were, and I think now it's our time to make sure that we pay that back, and that's why the British public have been so generous. But as I've mentioned before, whether it be Philippines, whether it be Gaza, whether it be Syria, or for Ebola very recently, the public has proven time and time again that they want to help, and they've demonstrated that they can help.
And can I just add to that, that when you're on the ground in these situations, so in Nepal, seeing the devastation, seeing that the DEC launched an appeal and watching as the money comes in, I mean, I don't know about you, but that feeling is just second to none, knowing that the public of the UK stood behind you and the people of Nepal in their hour of need. It's just an incredible feeling, it really is.
There can be a real sense in those situations that people feel forgotten by the world, and I think it does really matter to people, not just that people are coming from all over the world to support local communities, but actually that the money isn't just coming from governments, it's coming from ordinary people who are putting their hands in their pockets because they've been moved.
Well, when I've travelled to visit the kind of programmes, the kind of projects our member agencies are delivering, and I've spoken to the communities that the funds have benefited, they've always, without exception, been very grateful to the support of the British public. They hear about it, they get to see it, they get to learn about it, and they've always asked to feed that information back and say thank you on their behalf. And it's really standing in solidarity sometimes that's really the value. The money, of course, is welcome and does make a difference, but having that solidarity and standing side by side with the innocent victims who've just happened to be in a horrible disaster is what also counts the most.
Absolutely. And I think, as you were saying also, I think there's an incredibly powerful human with all of this. The response was really fast from the British public, absolutely fantastic. But I do think that's part of the sort of trust that's been built up with how the DEC operates. But this very human tragedy, people understand, we all understand, you can completely grasp what happens when a family loses everything. And I think people saw us responding in a very practical way, really human, practical things, shelter, water, food, making children safe. So I do think that there is a great human connection, in this awful situation. That's one of the quite rewarding feelings that you get from it when you're there.
That human connection and that sort of sense of solidarity perhaps brings us to the next question. So this is one that we've had from Lisa on Twitter, and she was asking about how Nepali groups who are independently mobilising aid to affected areas can liaise with DEC agencies and work out how they work together. And to me, that really speaks to, is the international aid effort just international, or does it connect somehow to what's actually happening in communities?
Well, I think I mentioned just a little earlier these disaster committees, and that's a really interesting example of how it is actually at the very local village level where people are helping each other, and the diaspora and people from Nepali communities in London and other towns and cities around the UK are getting their aid through and their financial contribution. We are working together, and those community disaster committees are full of local people, actually quite a lot of them run by ex-Gurkhas, which is interesting. And the people I met, the head of the disaster committee was indeed an ex-Gurkha, and they were getting aid from us, through the DEC, but also from cash transfers from people, yes, and in that sense we're all working really well together.
It's amazing. And Kat, you had a particular thing that you were talking about a little earlier before we came on air, where you wanted to speak a little bit about the importance of assessments. And I think this is overlooked. Why does it matter when you can see that a village is devastated, that you actually take the time to sit down and talk to people about what their needs are? Why is that important?
Yeah, I mean, it's exceptionally important, and it's a question I constantly get, even from my own family. I think because people imagine that aid, you can sort of throw it off the back of a truck almost and get the job done. But that overlooks a few key things. One is that that is not the way to reach the most vulnerable. You reach the most vulnerable by sitting with communities, speaking to the women, the children, the older community members as well, and actually building up a picture. What do they need? If they need food, which food is it? Because the wrong food could make them sick. What medicines do they need? Are they asthmatic? Do they need inhalers? Are they diabetic? Is it trauma injuries? What is it specifically that that community needs? Otherwise, you've got a whole truck full. So you have to go out to do those assessments, work with communities, and then come back and bring the aid that they specifically need. But it is often overlooked.
And coming back on those disaster management committees, it's if they've been working well, if we've done our job working with them well, they will have actually done their own understanding of their own communities. They will have mapped their own communities. They will know where the most vulnerable person is within that community. They will know that there is a old lady on her own as a widow down that road, and they will actually say and tell us and advise us and say, right, okay, we need to prioritise her needs. And they will have done some of the disaster management committees that Tier Fund works with. We get them to do evacuation drills. We get them to, like I say, map out their own community. We would work with them to leave kind of like a first aid kit with them. We will work with them to ensure that kind of like some of them are trained up to support in a community kitchen afterwards. So, you know, it's all of these things that we want to make sure that the local communities own as much of the response as possible. It's not just about coming in with big feet and being inappropriate. We really want to say, we want to be humble in the way that we work alongside these people.
Yeah. And also, sorry. Just you remind me that some of the things that the local people in the villages tell us they want are not immediately obvious. So, you know, the food, the shelter, the water is fairly obvious, but actually a lot of the information, the discussions we have at village level are telling us actually what the parents and the families want is some temporary schooling set up because the children are really traumatised. And if you get a bit of normal space back for the children. So, you know, we are setting up, I know SAVE is also child-friendly spaces and trying to set up temporary schooling. That also is the sort of thing, again, you might not immediately think of that as a first response, but the families say it's absolutely critical for them.
And of course, the secondary benefit to that is that the families can then go out and start to rebuild their lives because the children are being cared for. So it's got that dual benefit.
I think just to add this, for me, this is really about a partnership between the British public here in the UK and those that have suffered a disaster and making sure that we're not doing things to them, we're working with them. They're taking the lead in making sure that we help them meet their needs.
Thank you. And I think we've now got a call to action, which we're going over to. So this is our Text to Donate appeal. If you'd like to support the DEC appeal work and our members' work on the ground in the studio, then it would be fantastic if you can do that. Have we got time for one more question? Great. So I'm going to talk about the fact that some people are seeing, and this particular question comes from Mary on Twitter, some people are seeing a lot of people living in very simple conditions. So even in Kathmandu, there's many people living under tarpaulins, and some people are saying, well, why aren't they at least in tents? And this is a question I've heard a lot. It certainly was one I heard in Haiti. And only, I think there's a bit more to it than that sometimes. And this can be something that people perhaps, understandably feel is wrong. Why are sometimes tarpaulins perhaps more appropriate?
Yeah, well, there's a couple of issues around this. First and foremost, if you want to have an organised camp, you need a really quite a large amount of space in one place. And in Kathmandu, where it's a very crowded mountainous city, substantial big areas of space are perhaps not as easy as available. But I think the other thing to also say is that again we don't want to force people to move away from where they want to be. Sometimes people have a room left and they want to still use that room in their house, but the rest of the house is collapsed. And actually by giving just what we would call a shelter kit, which would be a hammer and nails, some wood, some tarpaulin. It gives them the opportunity to maybe stabilise aspects of their own home. And then it's a dignified choice. We want to stay here and we want to work with people to rebuild what we have. People don't want to leave their homes. They're displaced as a last resort, really. They go to other places as a last resort. They would far rather stay where they are.
I think often, people have this picture in their mind that whether it's refugees or people displaced in their own countries, they should be living in a big orderly camp with rows and rows of white tents. But I think that can be a bit of a trap, can't it? It can be a barrier to people actually moving on with their lives and beginning the process of rebuilding homes and rebuilding their livelihoods. What sort of situations were you seeing, Kat, when you were out there? What sort of circumstances were people living in, and what kind of help do you think they would most value?
Well, interestingly, thinking about families wanting to remain in their homes, or at least next to their homes, one of the big reasons that families were saying, it was to me, is that actually they don't want people to be coming home who have fled, who have gone to different areas, who have been out of touch. How on earth are they going to find them if they go to a camp somewhere? But they think if they stay there, then maybe their mum will come home, or maybe their grandma will come home. And that was actually particularly upsetting, I think for me to hear. Certainly the key needs from our side, and that Save the Children is working to deliver, are shelter, food, water, the kind of the essentials that I think everyone imagines there to be in the first phase of a emergency like this. But thinking slightly longer term as well, we touched on the trauma of children, enormous trauma they would have suffered. An earthquake, it's unexpected, it's traumatic because people die, there's lots of blood, there's dead bodies. Very difficult to explain that to a 4-year-old child. Why has that happened? How do you know it's not going to happen again? So that kind of, the care for the traumatised children is definitely key, and a return to education, a return to that sort of normality.
I've got a couple more questions that have come in that I'd really like to take, because there's some good questions here. So one from Peter on Twitter. He was asking Salah about the DEC Nepal quake funds, and this is a question people often had. What does the DEC do with that money? Can we spend it really on, a new office? Can we go out and buy some nice shiny 4-wheel drives? Do we spend it on the next disaster? What can we spend that money on if you give it to the Nepal Earthquake Appeal?
Well, there's a responsibility and a duty on the DEC to make sure that that money is spent on that disaster itself, in Nepal, on the victims of that disaster, on the needs of that community, so food, water, medicine, and so forth. Now, quite clearly, in order to deliver that aid, there are some costs. We talked about that. And member agencies are given a small allowance of no more than 7% to make sure those overheads in delivering that aid is spent wisely. But we do not spend the money elsewhere. We cannot do that by charity law, and obviously from a values perspective, we're completely wrong to do that. So it's the responsibility of the DEC to make sure, and the member agencies, of course, to make sure that the funds raised here in the UK is spent for the purpose what it was raised for. And in this case, if it was raised for the Nepal earthquake, it will be spent on the victims of the Nepal earthquake.
Great. Thank you for that, Salah. So some people are saying that... I beg your pardon, sorry, I've just lost my question there. So some people, and this is a common concern about fundraising, Salah, and it's one perhaps others will be able to identify with, is, if I give to the DEC appeal, am I going to be pestered forever after to set up a direct debit? We know why charities ask people for direct debits. They really need the money to fund their ongoing work. But I don't think that's quite how we work, is it? No, look,
DEC is also often being called a pop-up charity, where we do pop up when there's a major emergency, such as what we're seeing now in Nepal, and then we go back into the background. There isn't a disaster. So sadly, the last couple of years, we've seen very many disasters, so we've probably been out there a lot more than we would like to. We're one of those organisations that, thankfully, we don't want to be in the news, we don't want to be raising funds out there, because it means when we are, that sadly something terrible has gone wrong. But we don't ask people for direct debits, and we don't pester people for funds beyond the lifetime of any appeal.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
There's another question, Anoni, and this comes up all the time. I've heard this again and again and again. People are, because of these concerns about the way charities might use money, perhaps because they can't see the work that we're doing. So there's a trust involved. They want to give things. They want to give blankets, they want to give clothes, they want to give food. It seems really intuitive that that's the most direct way to help, but that isn't something that most charities do. Why don't we?
Well, we've had a couple of questions about cost, and we've been hearing about assessments as well, that there is an added cost of taking things from here all the way over to there. Our preference is to buy what we can locally, because that supports the local economy, that helps the whole communities kind of like remobilise and revive themselves. But also we want to know that there is a specific kind of like need that we can actually meet after we've done the assessment. We don't know whether the types of clothes that we want to send are appropriate climatically for what is needed out there. And sometimes what we like to wear is not what an average Nepalese woman would want to wear. So I think that the compassion is completely understandable, and really, you know, we thank for the thoughts and the wanting to give this kind of the support. But realistically, we really need to make sure that it's actually, we've listened to the people, we've actually understood. We don't want to be giving them peanut butter when they would prefer lentils, you know.
Mm. Is there anything people can do after they donated? I mean, obviously, one of the first things we ask is, you know, for people's money. And it's a question from Julia. What else can people be doing, Salah, to support us? And from the other members of the panel too?
Yeah, absolutely. I think obviously, besides the obvious thing to do, which is to donate, we would like people to share the news about the DEC and about our member agencies and what we're doing on the ground, to share that news with their family, with their friends, to fundraise. I think those are the kind of things that we would encourage people to get involved with. Already we're hearing wonderful stories of people doing sort of baking cakes or going on runs or jumping off planes or doing crazy things like that, and that's absolutely wonderful because it means that we can raise more funds and engage the UK public in so many creative and innovative ways.
Yeah. And also, I do think it's really important that people share the stories, the case studies. All of our websites and the DEC site will have information which tells everybody what we've been doing. And you know, that's one of the great things that people can share, and we need all that help. We need people to get the message through that this has been a fantastic effort by the UK public, but a worthwhile one. And you know, the evidence is starting to really come out, and so some wonderful stories about real successes of making the difference. So that's what we would like people to do too.
It's also about staying in touch. I mean, it's also about helping us as organisations to know how we can be more transparent, you know, how we can help other people more and more.
Like
and
this.
yeah, exactly. What we want to hear what are the concerns you have so we can address them and reassure you that we're doing the right things. So this, like, go to the variety of different websites of the different agencies, see the different approaches, see the different styles and the way that we're working, and then actually come back to us if there are any concerns, because we do want to hear if there are concerns.
So we've talked a bit about people championing the appeal once they've given, and that is hugely important. And one of our greatest champions is actually John Snow, and he's recorded a special message for us here.
Hi, I'm John Snow, and I'm at the DEC, the Disasters Emergency Committee. That's a committee which has brought together the 13 main agencies pulling together to raise money for Nepal. And the earthquake's consequences are still with us now, getting worse, if anything, rather than better, because more and more communities are being reached, devastated. And the costs are unimaginable. This is not just about immediate relief of food and immediate supplies. This is about a long-term commitment to build houses, to build streets, to rebuild industry, to build areas in which people can recreate. It's the Nepalese that need our help, and they need millions and millions of pounds. But amazingly, lots and lots of £5, £10, £50, £100, whatever you can spare, can make a fundamental and profound long-term difference. So please, please donate to the DEC. It's the best way of getting money directly to the people and the communities who need it in Nepal. Thank you very much.
So this is AskDEC, and we've got a couple more questions to go before we close. The next one comes from Margaret on Twitter, and she's saying, what can we do to make sure the humanitarian need is not forgotten in a few months? Because we have seen this before, where there's an enormous outpouring of support, and then very quickly, obviously, attention moves on. How can we try and keep this alive?
Well, that's actually a wonderfully insightful question, so thank you for that. I would say it's absolutely essential that people do follow us for the life of this emergency. I mean, the media attention is, of course, we've all seen it before, the media attention will die down over the coming days and weeks, but the humanitarian response is going to continue for months, if not years, to help get people back on their feet and get communities functioning again. So it's really important that people do stay in touch with the agencies, keep an eye on the news, keep asking questions, keep talking about it, keep raising money, because it is going to take longer than a couple of days, a couple of weeks, to really get Nepal back on its feet again.
Yes, I think we know that it's going to be years. That may be depressing for some, but it is the truth. And we have to do two things in parallel. We have to do the emergency, immediate, the humanitarian, urgent actions, but we know that everything, they've lost their livelihoods. And that is not a quick fix. So one of the other good things about how we all work together is that we are able to spread some of the funding after the emergency immediate needs are met. We will have the capacity to, over the next few years, still be there and stay there with our Nepali colleagues.
We will obviously also try to work with our corporate and our broadcast partners to make sure that we try as much as possible to keep this in the news, but more importantly also to keep reporting back on the good work that's happening in Nepal over the coming months and years to come. And our website, DEC.org.uk, will continually have updates almost on a daily basis, certainly, to make sure that we're reporting back on how that money is being spent.
Thank you, Sela. And we've got time for just one last question. I'm going to take one from David on Twitter, and he's asked, what precisely do you mean when you say there was a lot of disaster preparedness? So I think this idea of preparing for disasters is, it's a little odd. What does that involve? We've talked about a couple of different types of things.
Good question, because we're all full of jargon, and we want to try and make sure that it's accessible and understood by the public. So, I mean, preparedness means a whole load of different things. So we can work with both kind of like local partners. This means that the local NGOs, we can sit alongside them and say, where do you think the next landslide might be? Where do you think the next flood will be? Where and what can we do to strengthen, for example, a community to face an earthquake? So we know that there's been quite a lot of funding already poured into Nepal by the international community and by international NGOs to do things like strengthening buildings, because we knew that they were weak. And we've seen this disaster actually could have been worse. I mean, I think we forget, in actual fact, these figures are quite encouraging in terms of the fact that there have been lives saved because preparedness was done. And I think that's what we mean. We mean by making sure that there's pre-positioned supplies. So in other words, that we can actually deliver aid immediately. Some DEC member agencies have those pre-positioned supplies in place that they can actually get them out the door straight away. So preparedness is a massive word. It's a massive term and has lots of different components to it. And I could talk of it all day, but I know that
Can I just add on to that? Actually, even now with this current response, agencies on the ground are preparing for the next disaster. Yeah. So when agencies are helping those communities rebuild their homes, it's about strengthening and making sure the design of those homes are earthquake resistant. Certainly if it's going to be a big disaster, it's not going to stand, but if there's shocks and so forth, it'll be able to withstand those. So right now, as we're speaking, those agencies are working with communities to make sure that for the future disaster, they're as prepared as can be.
And some of it, so the communities that we work with, some very practical matters are dealt through with training, really good training sessions led by the communities for communication systems, so they know who to ring, they know which neighbours are going to deal with this part of the village. And we've seen that actually be put into practice, and it is working.
That's great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Anoni from Tear Fund. Thank you, Kat from Save the Children. Thank you, Tanya from Plan, and Sela from DEC. And thank you all for tuning in and listening to This is AskDEC. But before you go, we have just talked about champions, and we've had some amazing celebrity champions. We've had some very high-profile supporters, but we couldn't do this without you. And if you've already given, and many of you will have, there's one more thing you can do, which is look below, because there are a variety of links and assets. There's further information about what the DEC and its members are doing, and we would really love for you to share those with any networks that you are plugged into. If you could do that, that would be wonderful. Thank you very much.